All right, welcome everybody and welcome everyone on Twitch. I've been thinking back and forth about whether to continue to do the class simultaneously in person and on Twitch, and I think I am going to do it continue to do it on Twitch and in person. Happy to have you guys here, obviously. I prefer to have people in the class, obviously, but I understand that some people need to do this by Twitch, and it can be more convenient. It also makes more sense for you guys to have the recordings of the lectures. So as much as I can't bear to listen to myself lecture, so posting it on YouTube makes me ill every time I post it because I feel like I hear my own ums and ers. We'll do that for the rest of the semester. If post to packback that is due, chapter 8 and 9 today at noon, will be counted as the one that is due after break. No, the posts that are due for today at noon are for this week. And, I see. If you post afternoon today, it will count for next week. So it will count for the week after spring break. So the beginning of the next packback session is 12 o'clock today, if that makes sense. So you can post anytime during spring break, or you can post on Monday, of course. But it's basically not counting this week, but it will count anything you do this week in the week that comes ahead. So I hope that's a good answer to the question. All right, I want to talk today about the War of 1812 and the bigger background to the War of 1812. A lot of American historians tell the War of 1812 as if it just happens in Europe, but this is connected to a worldwide war, and we can't really understand the War of 1812. And lots of people write about the War of 1812, but don't really understand the kind of international situation. That's right. We technically have 2 weeks for the next packback session. Okay. So a little bit about land and the West, first of all. As I said previously, the biggest checkbook for the Congress after the Constitution is passed is Western land. Almost all Western land is given over to Congress. There are some exceptions, Connecticut and a few others. Virginia still have claim to some Western land, but almost all the Western land is given to Congress, and Congress decides to split up the land, to divide the land in a way that doesn't reproduce the errors or the problems of Virginia. Remember I said Virginia had that kind of higgledy-piggledy way of distributing land where you got a head rights and you created an area around your property that you claimed as your property, and you put rocks around it, and you had called out the meets and bounds every year. It was, and you get this sort of very sloppy looking land arrangement, which then leads to lots and lots of lawyers. And Jefferson in particular says we have to stop this, we have to prevent this from happening. And so what we see is a division of Western land that is negotiated sometimes in good faith and sometimes not with the native communities that are in the West, but Congress does claim this land after making treaties, sometimes with the land is claimed in the West. It's controversial how this land is claimed, but Congress does make it somewhat legitimate by signing treaties. This is initially Jefferson's proposed organization of the Northwest, and as you know, these are not the states that are Illinois and Michigan and Ohio. This was his initial plan, but as you can see, the whole plan from the beginning was a grid settlement in the West. And this is actually how Congress ends up doing it. And there's some important things here that are going to be very important for understanding the United States afterwards. First of all, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is really where we get a very sharp divide between slavery and freedom. Because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Congress's ordinance says, first of all this territory in the West is going to have trial by jury, it's going to have freedom of worship, and it's going to have no slavery. Okay? So these things are, as a couple people said on PACBAC that pointed out that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to states. And so to ensure that people get a trial by jury, no more star chambers, people have freedom of worship, no more Anglican bishops telling everyone what to do and charging taxes, and no slavery, these Western territories are formed. If you have fewer than 5,000 citizens, then you have a congressionally appointed governor. A governor is imposed on the region or chosen by Congress in consultation with people who are living in the area. A secretary and 3 judges. Once you get to 5,000 citizens, and that's of course men over the age of 21, they can elect a legislature. And that's just citizenship more or less as the United States defines it. And then a land office is going to sell land in a grid pattern, and income is reserved to support schools. And this is very important. Schools are critical to the American experiment because, as they see it, we think of schools as being places where you learn math, a little geometry, reading and writing, and those sorts of things. And that was important. But as Congress saw it, the importance of schools was that it would ensure that the land would be used in a way that would be productive. And so the kind of development of what we would call, I guess, SAT skills was seen as important for kind of further development and the kind of creation of a system of production that would produce a lot of grains and things like that for export, and also to create a kind of virtuous citizenry, right? Back to this virtue idea, this idea that people would be in a position to make decisions based on being able to read laws, that there would be, so it's very important as Congress sees it in the kind of really foundation of these Western territories to establish land in this format. And the land office is the one that's going to sell this land in a grid pattern. And a section is going to be reserved for schools. The Southwest Ordinance is passed in 1790. So the Northwest Ordinance is 1787, the Southwest Ordinance is 1790, and here we see a different story. In this case, with the Southwest Ordinance, it's barring slavery is illegal. Right? So the Southwest Ordinance says, provided always that no regulations can be made or to be made by Congress that shall tend to emancipate slaves. So the expectation here is that slavery will exist in the South, the Southern territories, and slavery will not exist in the Northern territories. And Congress sets that up. And this is really, helps for us to understand the Civil War. The kind of dividing line of the Civil War is really a territorial line. And while land is reserved for schools, in the Southwest, very few public schools are created. Almost no public schools are created. And this is an important issue because it's going to continue to, literacy in the Northwest is going to be higher than literacy in the Southwest. It's illegal. It's going to be increasingly illegal to teach enslaved people to read. The South is going to be, in some ways, a very different kind of society. And it's really established at the very beginning, all the way back in the 1780s. Much of the territory south of the Ohio River also was owned by what Americans then called the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Okay. Remember, as I said before, that land prices, as it's distributed, it's really part of Jefferson's policy that you're going to be smaller acres, so not 640 acres payable in a year. Instead, it's 320 acres and then 160 acres. with a discount for cash, but payable in 4 years. And the idea is that farmers will grow things, sell them, make some money, and then pay for the land that they have bought on mortgage. And this makes the land office the largest bank in the world in terms of as a mortgage bank. It's effectively lending to large numbers of people who are going to buy land in the West. Federal Land Office is incredibly popular. People rush to the land office on the day of the opening of Western lands for purchase. There's an expression that I don't think anyone living now uses, but to do a land office business is to do an amazing business. I guess there are people who are alive who have heard that expression. But to do a land office business is to do an amazing business, and what you see is just people rushing to the land office and lining up to claim the land. Now, the Southwest Territory, in particular Louisiana, what's important here is that there's already a system that's established in France. And as I said before, the French system, now that Louisiana becomes part of the United States, but the Code Napoleon is still the state law. And there are some things about it that are interesting and make New Orleans an interesting place. For example, the emphasis on the family interest, wives as partners, almost equal partners in the family, bastards are legitimized, and free persons of color have citizenship. But existing property tranches help to entrench the power of the largest landowners. There's a lot of kind of funny business when Louisiana is initially brought into the United States. There's all sorts of secret deals. People are able to claim land that was not even really settled at the time. People are backdating fake French land records and things like that. There's a lot of this end up in court. But if you look at the land settlement here in Louisiana, you can see what the kind of Mississippi River looks like in terms of property ownership, right? And this is just one little stretch of the Mississippi River. But as you can see, it's organized along the river. The river is the most important thing, and so you've got these little slivers of land along the river. These are hundreds of acres. And these are the largest and most powerful, wealthiest plantations. And so we see in a place like Louisiana and Mississippi the most extreme inequality in the United States is in places like Mississippi and Louisiana, in part because of this older land system. Did land prices drop and mortgages begin north and south or just south? Oh, sorry. Yeah, land prices, let's see. So land prices didn't drop, they rose, but mortgages existed in both the south and the north. The land office system, the whole system was you would get a, a patent for the land, which was not actually technically title. Title. If you have title to the land, it's a document that says you own the land. You get a patent to the land, which says you're going to own this when you pay us off. It's a little bit like a mortgage. You pay off the patent in 4 years, and that exists both in the south and in the north. Thank you for that question. Okay, and so this society, as I suggested, is a kind of interesting and somewhat biracial society, one in which there are landowners who are biracial in New Orleans. There are, in fact, free people of color who are voting in elections in Louisiana. But it is extremely unequal in terms of the land holding. Okay, so that's the land system. This ends up being bound up with the War of 1812 in complicated ways. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. In France, with 1793 is the beginning of the French Revolution. It lasts until 1803 or so, and at that point, a political figurehead emerges, Napoleon, who is a kind of Caesar, right? You've got a French Republic, and then a dictator comes along and beloved by the people, and so we have the wars of the French Revolution, and then we have the Napoleonic Wars. U.S. smuggling is really how the United States becomes an important economic power. U.S. smuggles goods between France and the French ports. Britain tries to put a blockade and prevent France from trading with its slave colonies. And they're pretty effective at this, but Americans can show up at a French port that has slavery, like Martinique. Which is blockaded by the British. They can pretend to have a broken spar or something like that, and then land in Martinique. You're allowed to land through a blockade if your ship is broken. And then they would end up selling lots of rum and things like that, and wheat and flour, not so much wheat, but flour to Martinique. And then they would load up with sugar and then go back out, and the ship would touch ground in Boston or Philadelphia or New York or Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, and then they would burn all the documents for the ship, including the bill of lading and everything like that, recreate new documents, and pretend that the sugar came from the United States, right? And then they would take that to France, right, to pass through the blockade. And so they would say, well, these are American goods. We're not bringing anything from the French colonies. We're bringing these purely American sugar into the French colonies. Okay, so that's smuggling. And this is the reason for the War of 1812. American historians will tell you it's all about, grabbing soldiers off ships or sailors off ships and stuff like that. And that's a pretext, really, for this war, the war between Britain and the United States in the War of 1812. The real issue is smuggling. The U.S. becomes the biggest importer and exporter in the world and this is a brand new country, right, in the world in 1800 and 1801 by effectively smuggling back and forth between France and French colonies, between Britain and British colonies as well, because France is also trying to block access to their ports. Now, these people are smugglers. They are also slave traders, some of them. And in 1807, the British orders in council restrict the carrying trade. U.S. merchants ignore it. In 1807 and 8, Jefferson tries to create an embargo to prevent, and this is discussed in the textbook, the embargo is an attempt to prevent American merchants from getting themselves into trouble. Merchants ignore it. There is this thing, remember, called the Bank of the United States. It started in 1791, started by Hamilton and Dewar. It has a 20-year lease on life, 1791 to 1811. And the reason that British merchants look the other way at first when American merchants smuggle is because many merchants are paid with stock in the Bank of the United States. Many of the most powerful and important merchants in Britain have stock in the Bank of the United States, and that stock goes up tremendously in value. They take bonds from the Bank of the United States, and the U.S. Bank of the United States pays off its bonds. This is very important for understanding the U.S. in the long term. The U.S. has never defaulted internationally. And this is unlike every other European state, every other state in the world. So the Democratic Republicans, though, and that's Jefferson, ensures that the Bank of the United States is not rechartered. So in 1811, everyone who has stock in the Bank of the United States gets paid. And they make a huge amount of money. But at that point, in 1811, there's no more reason for British merchants, like this guy, James Stephen, to look the other way, right? He's willing to look the other way as long as he's making money. Now he's not making money. And so he publishes this book called War in Disguise, The Frauds of Neutral Flags. There's a tremendous controversy in Parliament, this is not discussed in the textbook, about American smuggling. And this Anglo-British tension is what leads to the War of 1812. Question. So smuggling was the U.S. taking French sugar and selling it back to France as their own, and this started the war. It didn't start the war, but it was the key issue for Britain, that this American smugglers are making this money? Did Britain have no more interest in U.S. smuggling since they had no more stockholders? Yeah, exactly. They were not making any more money at this point. They were previously stockholders, but all the stockholders are paid off in 1811 when the Bank of the United States folds. Does that make sense? It's a little bit complicated, but it's crucial to understand. Now, at the same time, as there's all this war talk, British people in Parliament complaining about American smugglers, there are also people like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun who are called the war hawks. And they criticize the merchants for continuing to smuggle, and they criticize the British for keeping forts in Florida and Illinois, even though they were supposed to, according to treaty, have left those places behind, depending on how you interpret the treaty. And they want a war with Britain on any pretext. This seems kind of crazy that you would want to fight a war with Britain, the most powerful navy on the earth, but Henry Clay and Calhoun and others in the war hawks are all about war. And so you have people who support war in Britain against the United States, people who in the United States who support war against Britain. And the pretext for this conflict is that there are a couple of ships, American ships, that are pulled over. A couple of Americans are pulled off and drafted into the British Navy. This is probably fewer than 20 people, maybe as many as a dozen people. And this becomes the pretext for war. But the larger issue is the way in which the US has kind of intervened and played one side against the other in the Napoleonic Wars. All right, so let's think about the Napoleonic Wars a little bit. This is the reason that Americans need grain. You know, I apologize, I am obsessed with grain. I finished this book called Ocean of Grain, and it's all about grain. Yeah, I get it. Okay, so sorry, apologies. So why does Europe need American grain? It needs grain because basically Europe is on fire. Europe is on fire because there's a revolution in France, which extends outward from 1789 forward, all the way to 1803, when Napoleon comes to power in 1800, but really becomes the Emperor of France in 1803. He expands in multiple directions, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Milan, Austrian Empire. He fights Prussia. He creates what he calls republics at the major ports. So he lands at these ports. He turns them into republics. And they're basically just the port and a little bit of an area around it. And he gets them to swear not to sell grain to the United Kingdom. He wants to starve Britain because Britain can't support itself fully in terms of food. He calls them a nation of shopkeepers, Napoleon. He hates Britain, right? Britain is the key person that he's opposed to in this conflict, although he's willing to fight with everyone else in Europe to kind of become emperor of Europe. A couple of things. Napoleon is, right, he tries to reestablish slavery in Saint-Domingue. So there's plenty of reasons not to like Napoleon. There are other reasons to somewhat respect Napoleon, at least in terms of European conflict, because one of the things that he does is basically he moves in and he eliminates kings and queens and earls and all these other sorts of things. He tries to create something like representative democracies in Europe. And he is a brutal soldier and general, but also kind of changes much of Europe in large part by toppling kings and queens all over. Okay, so I don't want to, this class is not about Napoleon, but it's helpful to understand this. Russia, then, is sometimes an ally, sometimes an enemy of France. And in 1812, Napoleon begins a war against Russia. He sees Russia as the key threat. Why does he see Russia as the key threat? Because Russia is providing a large amount of grain to the UK from Ukraine, from the Black Sea. The current conflict in the Black Sea and Ukraine is the reason for the war is very different, or is somewhat different, but the issue is that Ukraine is an important place for the export of grain, and France wants to deny that grain to Great Britain so that he can starve it into submission. And this is how 500,000 soldiers sent from Russia to Moscow become 6,000. This image is kind of one of the most famous images to kind of, it's a graphic table. It shows, on the one hand, the size of the army. You see that brown line, and it shrinks as the French army moves east, right? So it's moving from east to west, and these are the various stations that they stop off along the way, and so you can actually see the rivers here. So it's kind of a map, and it's also it's showing you the size of the army as it gets to Moscow, as it's defeated in Moscow, and then the black line is it's returning back, and it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. At the bottom, you can also see the temperature, because this is also recorded by the army. And yes, and so the worst decline, as you can see, is you could argue that the temperature is the decline is worse when temperatures drop, particularly the 21st of November in 1814. Are there questions? Why did Napoleon? Oh, he didn't want to. Sorry, he wanted to starve the UK not of rice. I said grain, but it's basically flour. He wants to starve the UK of flour, which is coming from grain, wheat grains, not rice grains. Rice is an important food in Europe, but it's nothing like wheat, and so that's what he's trying to do is starve the UK. He also wants. He would also like Moscow. He wants to dominate and control Europe. Napoleon says when he starts this war, he says all of Europe will be either Russian or Republican in 50 years. So Republican is, because he's creating these republics in Europe, and so his idea is basically to eliminate kingship and nobility and things like that throughout Europe. And he sees himself as a Republican, someone who's going to bring republics, the French Republic, all around Europe. But he sees an expansionist Russia as being dangerous as well. Yes, there's a question. Didn't Hitler also try to invade Russia and failed due to weather and lack of food? Exactly. Yes, right. And opening a war on two fronts is a terrible idea. Napoleon did it, and Hitler did it too. Oh, it was Napoleon who said that all of Europe will be either Russian or Republican in 50 years. That was Napoleon. Okay, so there are reasons to starve. He wants to starve Great Britain, but he also wants to fight off Russia. Okay, so the issue then is that the U.S. is smuggling. That's at least how Britain sees it. The United States is spoiling for conflict, and it's the greatest merchant. Weirdly, goes from this little colony to being the single largest importer and exporter by 1800 and 1801, largely by smuggling. It's the largest importer and exporter in the world by 1801 or 1802. So the War of 1812, then, there are battles, but this is really mostly a story of British blockades of American ports in the War of 1812. We will be in person after spring break, somebody asked. Let me just show the number again. But I am going to continue to record these, and I am going to continue to do them on Twitch. I got enough sob stories from people, and I've also decided I don't love recording my lectures because I feel like somebody's going to nab me for critical race theory or something like that because I have something to say about race. But between you and me and everyone else on Twitch, fuck them. So, all right. So this is just me. Okay. Do we have you want to finish? If you haven't done the pack back for this week, you do want to finish for this week. If you haven't finished yet, and you really want to do it before noon, if you want to get credit for this week. Okay. The British troops burn Washington in August of 1814, and after this, the pro-British Federalist Party is dead. And this is important. You've got a two-party system, but historically, well, in the United States anyways, we had the difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists oppose the Constitution. They go away. The Federalists are seen as pro-British. The Federalists are seen as, trying to support the Bank of the United States, which is now a dead letter after 1811. But the crucial thing is, you don't want to be a party that supports your enemy at war. And so the burning of Washington is probably really the end of the Federalist Party. And the United States becomes one party after the burning of Washington, when British troops basically try to move into each of the ports and burn them. The U.S. does briefly burn York in Canada, which becomes later Toronto, but it's nothing like the burning of Washington. In fact, the White House is called the White House because after the executive office is burned, it's repainted white to cover the burn stains, and thus we get the White House. The aftermath of the War of 1812 is called the era of good feelings, and you'll see this in the textbook. Oh, questions. Do we have one afternoon, though, like to submit a question by Monday for the next chapter? You have basically from Friday afternoon until next Monday, like not the Monday of spring break, but the Monday after spring break to post. So you have plenty of time to post for the week after next. Oh, thank you. Colin answered that. Next Monday. Whoops. I think I might have deleted one too quickly. It's hard to see these and delete and watch my lecture at the same time. Okay, so the War of 1812 is resolved by a treaty between the United States and Great Britain. The Illinois and Florida forts are resolved. Basically, Britain will leave those forts. And there is the famous Battle of New Orleans, and the Battle of New Orleans takes place after the treaty is signed, because it takes so long for the news of the treaty to return to the U.S. that the Battle of New Orleans, in which the British are investing New Orleans, Americans try to invade and fight. Americans win the Battle of New Orleans, but it has absolutely no effect on the conclusion of the War of 1812 because the treaty has already been signed. All right, and so the end of the War of 1812 leads to, as you can see, a surge in land buying. Many soldiers have been promised land after the Revolution. There aren't a whole lot of soldiers in the War of 1812, but those people are also promised land. But mostly what we see is lots of people moving to the west. In the Southwest, many of the people who are moving there are people who are literally carrying gold in their carriages to buy land or to make down payments on land. And people just carrying everything to buy up land. And so land sales skyrocket after 1812. But the important thing here is to understand that wheat prices shoot up because of the war, right? Wheat prices are skyrocketing because of the war. And this is happening right now, right? Wheat prices have gone up 70% in the last 2 weeks. Not in the last 2 weeks. Since April of 2020, wheat prices have gone up 70%. They've gone up 25 or 30% in the last week. War makes wheat prices go up, right? So wheat prices go up. People then start to have impossible expectations of what the price of wheat is going to be, right? And so they buy lots and lots of land, expecting that they're going to be able to sell that wheat and make a fortune. Eventually, that war is going to end in Europe. Flour doesn't easily transport all the way from the United States to Great Britain or Paris or Rome or places like that. The colonies are still the major, so the Caribbean colonies are still the major source for this flour and things like that. As we'll see after spring break, though, Great Britain is going to, after 1814, clamp down on American sales of grain to the Caribbean. When that happens, grain prices are going to drop precipitously in 1818. And people who have bought land on credit will not be able to pay off their land. And that's the Panic of 1819. We'll talk about that next week. Thanks, everybody. Why did the War of 1812 relate to wheat prices? Yeah, there was a question there, and that basically the 1812, basically the war in Europe drives up wheat prices precipitously. And the end of the war is going to drive them back down again. Thanks, have a great break. Apologies for cursing on Twitch. I don't think anybody's ever cursed on Twitch before, so.